Sunil. How are you?
All good, all good. I think Dr. Yadav is also joined.
Yeah, he's there.
Yeah, hi Sunil, hi Gaurav, hi Amita, and good afternoon to everyone. I think we can start now.
Yes, we can start. Okay, so let's start, Pranjal. Is that okay?
Yes, sir, sure.
All right. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to yet another session on the Pediatric Hematology Oncology Training Program. The feedback which we have got now has been excellent. I think everyone, including the faculty, have been liking the sessions. The discussions have been quite interesting. So we thank all of you participating in these meetings, and especially the faculty for coming week on every week for deliberating their and sharing their expertise on the different topics which we have been rolling out. Now, today we have got another session lined up, and we have very senior faculties participating today in the discussion. So we have got Dr. Amita Mahajan, who is going to be moderating the session today. Ma'am doesn't need an introduction. She's a senior consultant and head of pediatric hematology oncology at Apollo Hospitals in Delhi. We have Dr. Gaurav Narula, who is a professor of medical oncology at Tata Hospitals, Mumbai, and also we all know is the editor of our Pediatric Hematology Oncology Journal. And Dr. S.P. Yadav, who is the director of Pediatric Hematology Oncology at Fortis Hospital, Delhi. So thank you very much, all of you, for spending this afternoon with us. We have a presentation from a fellow, Dr. Chandrika Verma. She works, I think, with ma'am at Apollo Hospital, and she's going to be doing the case presentation today. So we have got basically a didactic on approach to lytic lesion in the skull. So how do you approach a diagnosis? And then we have got case presentation on and question answers on how to approach a refractory LCH patient. So thank you very much. I'll hand it over to you, ma'am. Before doing that, I request everyone, to keep themselves on mute during the sessions. Raise your hand if you want to ask questions during the case discussions, and please participate. Please put your videos on, because we can see each other's faces at least. And last but not the least, at the end of the session, please give feedback, especially in the context of the timing and the day of this session. So because we are approaching almost 8 weeks, and we have decided after 8 we'll reassess whether this day and timing is suitable for most. So please give your feedback on that, and then we'll take a call in the future sessions. So over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Sunil, and a very special thanks to Gaurav and Satya, who've taken out time from their busy schedule. And I think we learn a lot from their experience today. We've actually tried to integrate the didactic, part of the meeting within the case discussion, and we'll see how we get along. So I'll request the fellow with me, Dr. Chandrika Verma, to start with the presentation for the first case. And Gaurav and Satya, we will ask you to give your inputs, but feel free to interject at any point. For the rest of the attendees, please you can put your questions on the chat box, and we'll try and see that we get them answered as much as possible. So hopefully we'll have a great session. Let's start without any further ado.
So very good evening to all of you. Today we are presenting some case scenarios of the Langerhans cells histiocytosis. So presenting our first case.
Pranjal, can you see the slides?
Yes, ma'am. We can see the screen. Can you just please go on the slideshow mode, ma'am, so that demo will.
We'll just start again. Yeah, just. Not able to move the slides. It's.
Ma'am, can you just close the slide and try once again?
Stop sharing and.
Yes, ma'am.
Restart it.
Yes, ma'am.
We'll do it one more time. Pranjal, you have
Ma'am,
the slides. Can you?
yes, ma'am.
stop?
Can you just, ma'am, close the PPT once and open the PPT again?
Yeah, we've done that twice.
Okay, ma'am. So let me share it, ma'am.
You can share. Let's see. Just give us a minute. I think.
Sure, ma'am.
Can you see this first case 1 now? Yeah.
No, ma'am. Your screen is not visible right now.
Okay. Let us try it one time. Otherwise, you have the presentation. You can open that.
Yes, ma'am. We can see case 1 now, ma'am.
Okay. But it's getting stuck. So can you try? So that we,
Sure, ma'am. Let me share the screen.
we'll stop sharing. You can share the slide.
Yes, ma'am. Is my screen visible, ma'am?
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
So once again, a very good evening to all of you. Presenting our first case, Master IP, 9-year-old male child. He presented with complaints of pain and swelling over the right temporal area for the last 20 days to the neurosurgery department. There was no history of fever, trauma, headache, vomiting, or any skin rashes. On examination, the child was alert, hemodynamically stable, and there were no signs of raised ICT or any cranial nerve deficit. On local examination, there was a 3/3 centimeter swelling present over the posterior aspect of the right temporal area. It was non-compressible, non-reducible, and with normal overlying skin.
Next slide, Pranjal.
Next slide, please. On X-ray skull, it showed a discrete punched out lytic lesion in the temporal bone as shown by the arrow in the X-ray film. His CBCs, LFTs, KFTs were normal. The CT scan head was done, which also showed a right temporal bony lesion with no other abnormality. He underwent curettage of the right temporal bony tumor.
Next slide, Pranjal.
On histopathology, there was a moderate amount of, there was a diffuse sheet of monomorphic plump to ovoid cells, which had this clefted appearance nucleus and which resembled the coffee beans. The background was mostly of the eosinophils and few neutrophils. On immunohistochemistry, it was positive for S100 and CD1A markers.
Next slide, Pranjal. Dr. Gaurav, so this is the classical patient that we see in our OPD with just a lytic lesion seen on the X-ray and a painless or sometimes painful swelling. And clinical examination otherwise does not reveal any other abnormalities. So what would be considered to be optimal disease evaluation for this patient?
You need to unmute, sir.
Gaurav, you are co-host, so you can unmute yourself.
No, I'm at my office and I'm not getting my laptop or anything else to work, so it's on a phone. So it's. I suggest if you could unmute me, it'd be nice. It's
Okay.
a bit.
Okay, we'll do that.
We can do that, but so you again, like we can't unmute you because you're the co-host. You need to unmute yourself. Sir.
All right. Okay.
Yes.
Got it. So. On his
evaluation for this patient with just a single clinical examination is just a lytic lesion of the skull and nothing else. So, what workup to do basically?
Right. So that's exactly it. This is on history and examination. So far, it's looking like a single, bone lesion, solitary bone lesion, clinically at least. And you have X-ray of the skull, which is confirming a single site bony lesion. What you need to know is histopathological confirmation of this lesion, and also you need to know whether any other bones or any other systems are involved, both by a combination of clinical and imaging and maybe some lab parameters also. So you would need locally a biopsy. You would need at least a skeletal survey to see any other bones involved. You would also need a thorough clinical examination to see for splenomegaly, hepatomegaly, and lymph nodes and any other skin lesions.
Examination doesn't reveal any other findings, and as we already stated, he underwent curettage, immunohistochemistry, and histology confirms LCH. So I just want to bring up that, what all tests do we need to complete the workup?
Yeah.
So skeletal survey, like you said, and
skeletal survey, and if required, if indicated by or any doubt on clinical, you may require to do an ultrasound also to look for organomegaly, and you would need some blood investigations to look for hematological involvement, and maybe by the biochemistry to look for any hepatic, especially derangement. So this would give you an idea of the organ systems involved, apart from the primary site, which we already know is a confirmed LCH.
What I just wanted to ask was that this is the right temporal bone involved. Would this mandate an MRI to look for pituitary involvement, or should we just go by clinical history of polydipsia, polyuria, and urine-specific gravity and osmolality? Because this is a CNS risk lesion. We'll come to that in a minute.
Right. So CNS risk lesion comes into a special category by itself. And if it is a base skull or if it is temporal bone, as you said, then it does mean that you should be evaluating. This is a bit of a conundrum in this particular case because it is only the calvarium which is involved clearly on radiology, and maybe an MRI may not be warranted. But if there was any evidence to say that the petrous part of the temporal or any one of the lower bones were involved, then definitely you would need to go for an MRI imaging. The other you might need to go for an MRI imaging is if you found the lower inner table of the calvarium also eroded, and there was any suggestion that this may be an intracranial extension, then again you might confirm that on a CT first, and if you see that, then you would require to go for an MRI. But you would require additional imaging if any of these additional features were present, apart from the.
Satya, what is the role for functional imaging like PET scan and bone scan in the evaluation of a child with LCH? Not just in this particular case, but you have skeletal disease, maybe single site, maybe multifocal. So, what is the role in the current era?
So LCH of a single site is always something which is easy to manage, and only thing we have to ensure is that there are no risk organs involved. So risk organs are if the patient has hepatomegaly or LFTs are deranged, if there is liver involvement, or there is a splenomegaly, or there is a lymphadenopathy is present, and so you have to look for these things. Plus, a skeletal survey is required to look at which all bones are involved. Can you hear me or no?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah.
So skeletal survey is a mandatory investigation.
Yeah. So for
benefit in doing a PET scan.
Yeah, I'm coming to that. So if it's just a single bone involved, doesn't need much of treatment, but if it's a multi-osteotic, then systemic treatment may be required. So a skeletal survey is good, but I usually go for a functional imaging like bone scan to look at all the bones. All the bone scan is not always confirmatory of other bone involvement. So it should be a combination of bone scan and skeletal survey, because sometimes some of the lytic lesions may not show on the bone scan, and vice versa, or bone scans may pick up some lesions. Otherwise, role of PET-CT scan, it's an expensive test. So if the family can afford, a PET-CT is always good, which then you need not do a bone scan, because PET-CT would show you the bones also. But if a patient cannot afford a PET-CT scan, I would do a bone scan and a skeletal survey and an ultrasound abdomen to look for any liver, spleen, and lymph nodes, etc. A chest X-ray as well, and do routine blood test, LFT, KFT, check for urine-specific gravity, look for electrolytes, and to rule out diabetes insipidus. And if it's a risk organ involvement, or if there is any feature of diabetes insipidus, then MRI of the brain may be indicated, and we have to look for loss of pituitary bright spot on MRI, which is typically seen in LCH. So that's what I would do.
Thank you, Satya. Pranjal, can we have the next slide?
So in this case, skeletal survey was done. It did not reveal any other lesions. Her blood investigations done were CBC, LFT, KFTs. They were normal. The early morning urine specific gravity and osmolality were within normal limits. His chest X-ray and USG abdomen was also normal. MRI brain was carried out in this patient to rule out the pituitary involvement.
So this is the workup that was done for this patient. Dr. Satya rightly pointed out, the PET scan is expected to see maybe more lesions, but currently it is not the standard of care in the evaluation of a child with LCH. And to be, the current protocols actually recommend that even if you were to do functional imaging like bone scan or you should have corroboration of that lesion on basic skeletal survey to actually count that as part of the disease involvement. Next slide, Pranjal.
So he was commenced on vinblastine plus steroid therapy. After 6 weeks, there was clinical and radiological improvement. On his X-ray, 6 weeks post-therapy, he had a decrease in the size of the lytic lesion with the rim of sclerosis. He was started on maintenance therapy with steroid, vinblastine and 6-MP. Presently, he is on follow-up and is doing great.
Next slide, Pranjal. So, Dr. Gaurav, if it's isolated skeletal lesions, what is the best way to assess response? We know that response to treatment is to be assessed after 6 weeks of therapy. And you know that the reason to give treatment, we'll come to that when we come to lytic lesions presentation, but we chose to treat this patient because of a CNS risk site involved, the temporal bone. And so what for skeletal lesions, what is ideal response evaluation and what would qualify as an adequate response?
Yeah, so actually it comes back to the earlier issue of functional imaging. So I just like to go back to that because when we say that a PET CT scan is not a standard of care, though that's technically correct, but it may not be the right way to portray it. PET CT scan has been a PET CT, not just a simple PET, has been accepted as a very valuable investigation for LCH by almost everybody. But what happens is that in a collaborative protocol like LCH3 and LCH4, where trials are to run across multiple institutions with different policies, you have to compromise. And for that, it was agreed that it was not a mandatory investigation. But it's not being a mandatory investigation does not mean that it is not a good investigation or that it is not a standard of care. In fact, I would go so far as to say that if
for the PET scan, what would be considered as adequate response at 6 weeks?
So right. So here we have not done. Here we are not done. So I would go by this, what do you call, a clinical response. When you do radiology, you are still going to see a lytic lesion over there, maybe with some amount of sclerosis. That will be too early for that to have set in, but you may get some amount of sclerosis, but you'll still see the lytic lesion. So the disappearance of the lesion on radiology is not going to be a criteria. A clinical, disappearance of the mass would be the maximum that you could hope for in this kind of situation. Otherwise, if you've done functional imaging,
if we did PET scan, what would be, metabolically an acceptable or adequate response at this point in 6
months? So again, if you have done a PET CT, you are going to see the lytic area on the CT, but the lesion should be metabolically inactive at this stage.
A complete metabolic response would be mandatory, or you would give 6 weeks more of vinblastine steroids, or decline in metabolic, because if it is activity better, you would.
So then you're coming to how
LCH4 algorithm. So if there was a significant decline in metabolic activity, would you be comfortable with that as labeling that as an adequate response?
So there are two different things. One is no evidence of disease, and there is then active disease better, and active disease intermediate, and active disease worse. So what we would aim for and hope for would be no evidence of disease. That would be ideal. But active disease better would also be sufficient to continue with the therapy, if that's what you're meaning. So we are talking about the implication of two different responses over here. The responses, two responses are different, but as far as therapy goes, the line of management may not change.
Yeah, so if it is adequate response, you would move on to maintenance therapy. Otherwise, if it is suboptimal response, you may consider 6 more weeks of vinblastine and prednisolone.
Yeah.
Next slide.
Active disease intermediate and active disease worse would definitely count for reinduction.
So, Satya, what would be the optimal duration of treatment in this child? Single lytic lesion of the skull in a CNS risk site with what we consider to be adequate response at 6 weeks, and we move to maintenance. So, what should be the duration of?
So basically, a single lytic lesion, bony lesion, I usually don't give chemotherapy at all, and that's my first preference. But if I decide to treat, like if it's a high risk area, it's a very big bony lesion, and the surgeon hasn't been able to curettage it fully, so or there is a lot of soft tissue component is there, then I would treat. So in that case, I would treat it for at least 6 weeks induction, like what you have given. And if there is no active disease, then give maintenance. If there is active disease better, then another 6 weeks of induction therapy can be given. So total of 12 weeks maximum can be given, vinblastine and steroids. And then maintenance can be given for about total of 24 weeks is the duration I would treat this patient for. And usually they do very well. There are hardly any problems. Occasionally there can be recurrence, but most patients do very well.
Okay, thank you, Satya. Can we move on to the next slide? So we'll cover this in a little bit because I was asked to cover this briefly, approach to lytic lesions of the skull. Next slide. So intradiploid skull port lesions are rare, but within, hematology oncology units, we will all see a few cases every year in, depending on how busy our centers are, every year. They may be incidental findings or present as a painful or painless swelling. And there is a broad differential diagnosis, though to a pediatric hematologist, oncologist, usually it will be LCH that comes first to the mind. I'll just go to a few other lesions. They can sometimes pose a diagnostic dilemma, as the lesions that I will describe do share many imaging features, and the interpretation requires imaging characteristics and clinical settings, and finally histological diagnosis to make a clear-cut diagnosis. Next, Pranjal. The lytic lesion will usually be picked up on an X-ray, and the first question for us is that whether we need a CT or an MRI. The CT is helpful in evaluating the lesion density and assessing whether it's a focal and diffuse, and recognition of possible pathognomic patterns, because some physiological variations such as trabecular pattern in a hemangioma can be classically seen on a CT, and also a periosteal reaction is best picked up on a CT image. MRI is more useful in assessment of marrow involvement and of intra and extracranial extension, and sometimes when we are evaluating CNS risk lesions, or there is an associated features of DI, we may actually choose to do an MRI because it will help us in doing both characterizing the lesion as well as looking at the pituitary at the same time. So I think this has to be decided clinically. So when we see a lytic lesion on the skull X-ray, is it always LCH? Well, no. The commonest lytic lesion on the skull in a child is actually an intradiploic epidermoid or dermoid cyst. LCH is the second commonest, but you can have fibrous dysplasia, metastatic lesions, osteoma, ossifying fibroma, lymphoma of the bone, hemangioma. Next slide. And some physiological variations such as arachnoid granulations and venous lacunae, which may all show up as lytic lesions on the skull. I'll just take you through a few examples. So this is this example of an intradiploic epidermoid cyst. And I think you can see that, there is a large lytic lesion here with the inner table almost completely destroyed. And that's classical for an intradiploid epidermoid cyst, that the inner table is destroyed while the outer table may be relatively preserved. Next slide. This is an example of an intraosseous hemangioma, which would again show up on an X-ray as a lytic lesion, but on the bone window of a CT, you can actually see that there is almost a spoke wheel pattern inside, and both inner and outer tables may be preserved unless it's extremely large and erodes. But it would, because it's a benign condition, there isn't actually that much erosion. So both tables can be preserved. Next slide. This is an aneurysmal bone cyst, classically seen in the humerus, but you can occasionally see it. 5% of ABCs actually occur in the skull, and they will show us up as a classical lytic lesion. But the interesting thing is that often they may see as fluid levels. In fact, if you can see the bottom 3 images, you may actually be able to see that there is a fluid level within the, and that would be the classical picture of an aneurysmal bone cyst. Next slide. This is the picture of a bone desmoplastic fibroma. Again, you can see there is thinning of both inner and outer table, but not erosion. And it can be, very atypical. It's not like a clearly punched out lesion as you would see in a LCH. Next slide. And again, finally, we have lots of metastasis, like neuroblastoma, which can classically present with a metastatic lesion in the skull. And here you can almost see like an, spicules on the heron end appearance that you can see in the large lytic lesion in the skull. And this is actually the CT of a bone, CT bone window of a child with neuroblastoma. Next slide. And again, if you see multiple lesions, you may again need to think, well, it can be LCH, but if there, you may also need to consider that these could be metastasis from a malignancy elsewhere, most commonly a neuroblastoma in a child. Next slide. Now, this is just a very briefly 1 or 2 slides on a case that recently foxed us. 5-year-old female child who presented with history of boggy swelling over right frontal and left parietal region for 1 month. The X-ray, as you can see, showed 2 lesions. You can actually, I think you can appreciate one on the right side and the left parietal bone. And they were, one was clearly punched out, but the other had a relatively corrugated pattern. It was classic. The child had no other systemic symptoms, no other features of any systemic disease. Next slide. This is an MRI picture of the same slide, which actually gave us the clue that this may not be LCH because there was actually involvement of the marrow as well. So an FNAC was attempted because it looked as if there's maybe, though this is looking like LCH, it could be something else. And to our surprise, and after many years I saw, next slide, the FNAC actually showed classical granulomas, and which was positive for acid-fast bacilli. So this was a case of Pott's puffy tumor that I think we read in our books, Bailey Love, and very unusual, and the gene expert from this FNAC actually confirmed resistance to rifampicin. So if we go back to the X-ray, Pranjal, can you go back to the 2 slides? You can see that there were, telltale signs that there is a little corrugation. It's not a clearly punched out lesion that we normally see in LCH. And also that there may be at areas there is already some sclerosis from the reaction because of the inflammation. Next slide. If we can move to this. So in LCH, bone is the commonest organ involved in children, and within the skeletal system, skull is actually the commonest bone involved. Usually the lesions will be rounded, sharply delineated without any sclerosis, unless you've done like a curettage or a biopsy, which may trigger a reaction or healing. The commonest bone involved is parietal, which is actually a non-risk bone. And the erosion of inner table is much more than outer table. And on CT, this may look like what we say is a hole within a hole sign. Next slide. So the workup for a simple, lesion, like already have been told by our experts, is history, examination to look for other, other organ involvement, skeletal survey, CT, the routine blood test, and CT and MRI, which we choose depending on what we want to do. The role of PET scan, PET scan is definitely a good tool, but whether it needs to be done for every case and serially, that is the matter, so that's why it's not been integrated in the current protocols. But like Dr. Gaurav highlighted, it does help us because response evaluation, especially for skeletal system, is always a little challenging. Next slide. So this child, FNAC may give you a clue, but most centers would need for immunohistochemistry a core biopsy. For a single lesion, curettage may be all the treatment it is required. Like Dr. S.P. Yadav said, that normally he would not like to treat a single lesion of the bone, but I'll just share what the current recommendations are. The diagnosis is based on histology and immunohistochemistry. The main feature is the morphological identification of characteristic LCH cells, like was already shown. Next slide. So the classical LCH cells are plump or ovoid, and the classical thing is this nuclear clefting that you see. S100 is a non-specific marker, CD1A or CD207, which is the surrogate for Langerin, is actually what is needed for a definitive diagnosis. If you read in your books, it may say that Verbeck granules were needed to be documented, but CD207 or Langerin is actually the surrogate marker for that, and that's actually the best test to do. Most of us have access to CD1A, and that's what gives us the definitive diagnosis. Next slide. So the workup that is recommended is urine specific gravity and osmolality with CNS risk lesions are involved to look for evidence of DI, a chest X-ray and ultrasound abdomen, and a bone marrow only if there is cytopenia of at least 2 cell lines. The role of bone scan and PET scan varies from center to center. So some centers may, like I said, it's not part of the standard protocols, but increasingly its, importance is being realized. So in selected cases, we may choose to do that, or if you have access to it, yes, you can choose to do that. But the corroboration needs for skeletal lesions, there needs to be corroboration from the skeletal survey as well. Next slide. So we classify the disease based on whether a single system is involved or multiple systems are involved. And within that, whether or not in multiple systems, whether or not risk organs are involved. So you may have unifocal bone disease, like in this case, or just unifocal skin disease, or unifocal lymph node involvement, lung, CNS, or any other system involved. And then you may have multi-system LCH, where risk organs may or may not be involved. And for definition today, hematopoietic system involvement, liver and spleen classifies at high risk in organ involvement. Next slide. So this slide just shows that bone is the commonest system involved. Skeletal is the commonest system involved in childhood LCH, followed by skin. And this is the relative frequency of individual system involvements. Next slide. So in terms of management of lytic lesion of the skull, it really depends on the site. If it's a non-CNS risk lesion, which is parietal, frontal, and occipital, a curettage would really be all the treatment that is required. Sometimes people may choose to treat, if there is, it is recurring, but if it is CNS risk lesion, so the CNS risk lesion is classified as orbit, temporal bone, mastoid, sphenoid, zygomatic, ethmoid, maxilla, but not mandible, paranasal sinuses or cranial fossa with or without intracranial soft tissue extension. So these lesions qualify as CNS risk lesions. And current recommendation is to treat these with systemic treatment. The systemic treatment is really not for the healing of this lesion. That would happen regardless, as well as it would happen in non-risk lesions. The primary purpose of treatment is to reduce the chance of DI and neurodegenerative CNS LCH. I'll just come to that in a little. Next slide. So this side shows just temporal bone involvement with intracranial extension. So this side would qualify for treatment primarily to reduce the chances of subsequent DI or CNS neurodegenerative LCH. Next slide. While another patient which has multiple sites involved, frontal, parietal, occipital bone, we may still not choose to treat because these are not, but if there are multiple, again, that may be the reason to treat. So next slide. So in terms of who, this evidence was given by Groy et al. A few years ago, actually, looking at all the previous trials and what happened to patients with skull lesions. And those who had craniofacial involvement at diagnosis, particularly of the ear, eye, and oral region, carried up to 30% chance of developing DI or neurodegenerative LCH. And this risk is augmented when the disease remains active for a long period or reactivates. So the isolated skull lesion may not bother the patient, but because there is some evidence that if the lesion remains active for a long period, it may increase the chance. That is the purpose for treatment. Next slide. So the current recommendation would be single site skull lesion, non-CNS curettage. If it's multiple bones or CNS high risk lesion, we would give them, stratum 1 therapy. Again, if it was other systems or involved along with lytic lesions of the skull, they would receive vinblastine and steroids. Next slide. So this slide just shows that skeletal system or skull lesion involvement alone would actually have a very, very favorable outcome, with almost all patients having a good long-term survival. Some may, yes, go on to have DI or CNS LCH. But these again shows that if you have more, if you have 3 risk organs involvement, which are really liver, spleen, and bone marrow, your outcome would be much, much worse. And it just shows how, with individual organ involvement, how what is your prognosis. Next slide. So I'll request Chandrika to present now case number 2. That's something we are struggling with right now.
Coming to our next case, Master Y is 3-year-old boy presented with acute onset respiratory distress with history of intermittent fevers. There was no history of any cough, coryza, or foreign body aspiration. His chest X-ray showed right-sided pneumothorax with multiple cystic lesions in the bilateral lung field. The right ICD tube was inserted for the pneumothorax. This was the chest X-ray showing right-sided ICD in situ.
Next slide, Pranjal.
The CT was done, which showed diffuse numerous cysts of variable size, shape, and wall thickness in both lung fields, with tiny small nodules in the right lower lobe with generalized ground glass haziness with right-sided pneumothorax. These features was consistent with Langerhans histiocytosis.
Next slide.
So his bronchoscopic alveolar lavage was inconclusive. So we went for the thoracoscopic lung biopsy, which was consistent with LCH. The ISC showed CD1A and S100 positivity with MIB labeling index of around 15%. He has been started on vinblastine with steroids. Currently he is in the 3rd week of therapy, and still he is having intermittent respiratory distress, and bilateral ICDs are in situ.
Next slide.
Laboratory workup done so far includes CBC, LFT, KFT, skeletal survey, USG abdomen, early morning urine specific gravity and osmolality. All of are within normal limits.
Next slide. So Gaurav, what do we expect for this patient? What is the likely clinical course looking at the CT images?
Not good. So the thing is that the lung is not considered as a risk organ per se as far as activity of the disease is concerned. This kind of extensive pulmonary disease which we see leaves a very very little respiratory membrane left intact. Though involvement of the respiratory membrane is late in fibrocystic disease in the lung. So oxygenation is generally maintained, but initially there's a increased work of breathing, which eventually leads to a sort of a ventilatory failure, and the respiratory failure comes later. So this is a sort of an inexorable course which it ends up taking, because even though as the lesions disappear with treatment, the active disease may disappear, but the healing and the fibrosis and sort of process often continues. It's the same sort of a similar pattern which you might see in the liver sometimes, but pathologically they may, though they are different kind of lesions, but sequelae wise they can proceed the same. So you may be able to control the disease, but you may still not have a good outcome for the lungs. So even with inactive disease and disease control, progressive respiratory failure may be anticipated in this patient. It will be gradual, but it could be anticipated. One patient which we saw came with lung lesions like this, extensive all over. He died within a week of presentation to us. It can be that bad. Ultimately, you may have to look at an organ transplant even if you control the disease.
So Dr. Gaurav is right that lung does not qualify as a risk lesion, and in fact, if you look at the outcomes that we gave, lung patients with isolated lung LCH will have up to 80% survival. But the problem is mechanical in this case. So though the disease will not be active, the child will definitely be left with restrictive lung disease. He's in his 3rd week of therapy. He is currently in oxygen. So we'll see how it goes. Next slide. Satya, again, Reassessment for lung LCH is another challenge, because even PET CT is not supposed to be the ideal modality for this. And with such a bad looking lung on day one, how do we assess the response at 6 weeks? And what would qualify as an adequate? Is Dr. Satya there?
Let
Satya,
me.
you are a co-host, so you can unmute yourself. Just
Okay, I think, ma'am, I've unmuted him. I think he maybe left the session. Yeah.
He's requesting to be unmuted.
Yeah, I'm there now.
Yeah, Satya. So this is, a challenge that, okay, we treat him, we tell the family that yes, he does, at the moment, he does not seem to have any other organ involvement.
So I just few comments. First is that this is an ideal case where a PET CT scan would be more helpful than not, because in lung, it's difficult to judge the response. And if there is like the cystic lesions will stay the same, but if there are nodular lesions or other lesions in the CT and bit of FDG, AVDT in them, then when you treat and you do a repeat PET CT scan, the FDG, AVDT decrease would tell you that the child is responding. So a functional imaging would be giving you some sense where you are heading. Another is the clinical improvement.
Do you feel that PET scan would be the way to go? Gaurav?
And Satya had not finished his answer, so I mean,
let me finish. Yeah. So the other thing is that one is the functional imaging, another is clinical improvement, that the oxygen requirements go down and the repeated pneumothoraxes stop. You're able to remove the ICD and the child doesn't have a pneumothorax again. That tells you that the disease is coming under control and the child is responding. And in terms of overall prognosis of lung disease, like what Gaurav said, that this is very bad, but in my personal experience and as per the literature also, despite it looking horrendous, CT scan, child needing oxygen, such children usually with treatment, they improve, and improvement is quite good. But yes, whenever you do their CT scan, X-ray, the X-ray or CT would look horrendous. Always, those cystic lesions will stay for many, many years, maybe forever. But they do improve and they do live for many, many years. And out of all the lung LCH such cases I've treated, I've just had one patient who was in big trouble and finally died. But others all have recovered and they're doing okay with follow-up of like 5 years or 7 years or so. Thank you.
So yeah, thanks, Satya. So Gaurav, would you agree that what?
So I agree, because what you have to remember is that LCH is a very the manifestations are very myriad, and even in one particular organ, the degree and extent of involvement and the course that it takes can vary from case to case. So we all get colored by the few cases that we see, but it's only when you look at them as a group that you realize that they may or may not do that well. So when patients come with extensive disease, like I said, so you wanted two questions over here about the response evaluation and about PET CT. So for PET CT, I'll answer that first. We do PET CT in all, so we do monitor even the responses even for pulmonary LCH with PET CT. Having said that, it has its pluses and minuses. You can pick up the activity very well, but the nodular and cystic components are actually very well picked up by the thoracic lung window of a regular CT scan. So that actually works quite well as for equally for lung LCH. But definitely the activity reducing is something which you pick up with functional imaging. This becomes important because you need to find out in lung LCH after a while what is the problem due to active disease and whether it is sequelae. This is very important if you're going to get deteriorating lung function over time. So because if the patient doesn't have active disease, then if he's having deteriorating lung function, you can consider a lung transplant in ideal circumstances. That's why it becomes important. So I would go with PET CT and agree completely with Satya over there. The reason why lung was removed from a risk organ was because, as Satya said, that when you look at them as a large group, they do well. The reason was, again, I had alluded to that when I had answered first, respiration, oxygenation is maintained almost till the very end in pulmonary LCH. It's a late feature. So respiratory failure is a late feature. Mechanical, that is ventilatory failure, is an earlier feature. It's the work of breathing constantly over time, which like this patient is already requiring oxygen. This like the kind of constant support, it leads to an earlier mechanical failure, ventilatory failure before the respiratory failure occurs. So despite the CT looking horrendous, oxygenation is maintained till late in the disease. So that is there. But when you get extensive disease, when you have involvement everywhere, what we see is that even when the healing occurs, it is often with fibrosis. And this kind of procedure, even though the lung disease comes under control, when you consider in the context of children, several years is not enough. They have to have a lifetime ahead of them. So I would still say that extensive lung disease needs to be treated, and with the long-term rehabilitation, pulmonary rehabilitation, and the possibility of a transplant in mind.
Thank you. A number of you posted your suggestion that this patient should be taken up for pleurodiscs. He's actually undergone bilateral pleurodiscs. So we'll see how the outcome is. Let's move to the next case.
So pleurodiscs and all you need to do to continue to get a good functional outcome.
Or mechanical, yeah. So
part of the management.
Yeah.
There was one of the questions posted there with regards to liver and spleen involvement, whether the size itself is good enough. If they're enlarged, they should be considered involved, or you need a CT scan, to differentiate that. So if you could take that now, that's part of the workup question.
Satya, would you like to answer that? I can, Satya?
Yeah, I think it should be taken as involved. There is no need of doing a biopsy in liver or in the spleen. If the liver is enlarged or the spleen is enlarged, then it is taken as involved. We do only liver biopsy when there is sclerosing cholangitis or LFTs are deranged. Then you may do a biopsy, especially if the alkaline phosphatase and gamma GT are raised, that to prove that this sclerosing cholangitis is because of LCH.
Yeah, so the current LCH4, going by the LCH4 recommendations for spleen, it's just if you have palpable splenomegaly more than 2 centimeters in the in the extended line, then it's positive. For liver, 2 out of 3 are needed as per LCH4 recommendations. One is size more than 3 centimeter in mid-clavicular line. Second is, deranged LFT. And the third is actually histological. So if you have 2 out of these 3, then liver is considered involved. And for spleen, it's only the size because there is no other way to assess. There's a few other questions, but I think we will, they're more relevant to the next 2 cases. So I'll take them up as when we come to that.
So coming to the next case, Master TP presented with fever, vomiting, diarrhea at 5 months of age. He was initially treated as sepsis at a center in Patna. On direct questioning, there is history of skin rash present at the onset of disease. In the view of non-improvement, he was referred to a hospital in Delhi. There, CT revealed mesenteric lymph nodes. He was diagnosed as Langerhans cell histiocytosis on the basis of mesenteric lymph node biopsy.
Next slide, Kanjan.
He was initiated on vinblastine and prednisolone chemotherapy there. PET-CT done at 6 weeks showed complete metabolic remission. He was started on maintenance therapy, but unfortunately within 2 months, he had flaring up of symptoms and presented again with intestinal obstruction. At this time, PET-CT was done.
Next slide, Pranjal.
Which showed diffuse increased neural uptake along the entire stomach, duodenum, and the proximal jejunal loops. And there was multiple mild FDG, bilateral, cervical, mediastinal, and mesenteric lymph nodes, which were closely abutting and compressing the adjacent bowel loops.
Next slide.
He was commenced on cladribine chemotherapy. After 2 cycles, there was planned progression prior to the formal reassessment again, and he was referred to us for further management. At presentation, he was severely cachectic. He was 6 kg at 1 year of age, having complete intolerable feeds and persistent diarrhea. He was commenced on total parenteral nutrition and other supportive care. Next slide, please.
So, Gaurav, perhaps you can take this because we were asked to specifically cover a refractory. When do we label LCH to be refractory?
So, short AD intermediate, active disease intermediate or worse after at least 2 rounds of induction would be definitely refractory. If it is worse and it is risk organ involved, then maybe after the first round of induction itself, AD worse should be taken as refractory.
But this,
Or at least indication for stepping up the therapy. But less than that,
this child would be refractory by,
I don't know whether I missed a slide, but what was the initial treatment?
steroid for 6 weeks. He showed good clinical response. Metabolic CR was put on maintenance but progressed within 2 months, at which point he received single agent cladribine. But before he could be formally reassessed, he had further progression.
Yeah, right.
So you would label this would be refractory by definition.
So it's actually you have documented a full response, haven't you?
We documented a full response, but within 2 months, there's progress. So I'll just go to the. Can we share the next slide?
Yeah.
Not been able to. So as per the LCH4 criteria, like Dr. Gaurav very rightly pointed out, so if it's progressive disease, AD worse, active disease worse, at 6 weeks, we could consider it refractory already. If it's active disease, intermediate or worse in non-risk organs, or active disease better in risk organs at 12 weeks. If it's progression in non-risk organs at any time during continuation treatment. So this is where this child comes in. We did document a metabolic response, but there was, as just on continuation treatment very promptly. So yes, we could, it's semantics whether we label it as recurrent, but by LCH4 criteria, this could still qualify as refractory, but the management would be the same for both, so, that's just semantics, what language we use. And if it's AD, active disease, intermediate or worse in risk organs who do not meet organ dysfunction eligibility criteria at any time of strata 1 treatment. So for example, if it's liver involvement, sclerosing cholangitis or bad lung could be a sequelae but not active disease. So this is just to differentiate that. And if we have active disease at the end of strata 1. So these are the criteria. Next slide. Satya, at this point, this child has received vinblastine and steroid. He relapsed or, refractory, whatever we want to call it. What would be the best treatment option for this patient at this point?
So first is that this is the typical scenario. The infants, they do mostly very poorly. The prognosis of infants is not good, especially if they have a risk organ involvement. And this is an infant with the risk organ involvement. So this tells that this child, especially if he has relapsed on treatment so early or has a refractory disease, if we say it, so early in the course of treatment, his prognosis is poor. So we all know that such children don't do well. Now coming to what are the treatment options. So treatment options wise, whenever someone has a relapsed or a refractory disease, then cladribine based regimens have been used throughout for last 15 years or so, whether we use cladribine alone or in combination with high dose cytarabine. On the current protocol, on the current salvage protocol, cladribine and cytarabine, high dose cytarabine combination was a good option. Here you have just given cladribine, but the child has not responded. So I think even when we combine with cytarabine, he may still not respond, but that treatment option is there. You can again give another course of cladribine plus high dose cytarabine and the child may respond. But the other option upcoming is clofarabine instead of cladribine. So you may opt to give this child clofarabine as a treatment and see if he responds to that. And other thing is that in the biopsy, look for BRAF mutation. If BRAF mutation is present, then a targeted therapy, vemurafenib, can be tried, and that is found to be highly effective in those patients who have these mutation. The response rate is close to 80 to 90%. So one of the series showed that out of 58 patients, 38 achieved complete remission and the remaining achieved partial remission. So it can be a bridge to further like a transplant, allogenic transplant if required in this child, or maybe a maintenance can be given for a long time because as soon as you stop this medicine, they relapse. That's the problem with this. So I would say that I would, if the BRAF mutation is present, I would try to give Vemurafenib and see how the child goes. And later on, if complete remission, maybe an allo transplant can be done. But if it is not available, then I would try Clofarabine as the other therapy option. Thank you.
Thank you, Satya. Gaurav, there's a couple of questions from the attendees that the patient showed good response to vinblastine and steroids initially. Why not give 6 more weeks of the same? What would you say to that?
So why not give 6 more weeks of the same? Because he relapsed very soon after that. So it's obviously not going to be adequate. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So another question came up that etoposide is an active agent. Is there any role of etoposide at this point in this child's management?
Yes, there is. What we do, as you know, though I agree with the options because that's what Satya has delineated, because that's pretty much what is the recommendation from the large studies. But as you also know, we do not follow the same because we had to go for alternatives at that time, and it turned out to be successful, so we are stuck to it. This patient we would have treated with etoposide from upfront, and we don't use it IV, we use it orally. I think we published that protocol, so it's there in pediatric blood and cancer. And they get a very good response even with risk organ involvement, especially we use it only when there's risk organ involved, either at presentation or at recurrence. I would technically call this a recurrence since you documented a full response, though it is possible that an active site was missed. Even not having used it up front, if it has recurred, like in this situation, where Cladribine was given instead of Cladribine, at that time, we would have probably gone for vinblastine and steroids, but not by themselves, but with the addition of etoposide and 6-MP at that time, that is a sort of an induction protocol which we do use for our high-risk patients. We have had excellent responses with that. We have not lost a high-risk patient since we started that, and it's been several years now. So that is something which could work. When we do go for refractory treatment, Cladribine, we had in fact, we have a publication from our institute, Dr. Kurkare was there at that time, of the use of single agent Cladribine, and it worked quite well, but we found that it was, for this kind of patient, we would require to go for Cladribine, Cytarabine, having failed the first 2 lines. So supposing we had given etoposide again and the second time and again it had come back, then we would definitely go for Cladribine, Cytarabine combination. If that failed, then we would be looking at down the barrel. The other thing is that with BRAF inhibitors available, we have used BRAF inhibitors in situations like this if the biopsy is shown to be positive, but we cannot continue BRAF inhibitor indefinitely, and many times the patient cannot go for transplant. So we do use it to bring the patient, stabilize the patient, bring the disease under control. When organ systems are normal, then the patient is in a much better general condition, and then you can continue back with the chemotherapy protocol, high-risk protocol, whatever you're using, and hope to get a long-term remission from there. If that doesn't happen, then you have to go for transplant and other options. So there is room for play for other options before you go for such toxic therapies. The other option in refractory disease is something which Revati had put out, and we did try that in a couple of situations, and it worked very well, and we are also looking to adopt that now as our refractory protocol as part of the IMPOG study. That's
I'll come to that because in a minute also, so we'll cover it there. So I think what both Dr. Satya and Gaurav have highlighted, that there is no one treatment strategy for refractory LCH. You will need to, though there are some guidelines within the LCH4 protocol, for example, but there is, you have to individualize treatment for every patient, and we have these options, and one may pick up, and a number of factors would go into what you would choose to treat. We'll just share how we treated this patient. Next slide. Pranjal, next slide.
So we tried getting the tissue from the previous center, but there was not sufficient tissue to study for the mutation. So he was started with Clofarabine chemotherapy, but he had a very stormy course during his first cycle with severe neutropenia and thrombocytopenia, but he recovered from that and he had excellent clinical response. His diarrhea subsided, he started gaining weight, and he was active and playful. After 4 cycles, a reassessment PET-CT was done, which showed good metabolic response, but still showed some residual activity.
Next slide.
This is a PET scan comparing the previous and this time after 4 cycles of clofarabine therapy, and he was showing decrease in the FDG-avid lesions, but still the residual activity can be appreciated.
Just one small area of activity could still be identified. Next slide. So we can move to the next slide because we've already.
So he was given 2 more cycles of clofarabine chemotherapy. There was constant weight gain. At admission, he was 6 kg, and sequentially on follow presently, he is double that weight. He is 12.6 kg. He has been commenced on lenalidomide dexamethasone based maintenance treatment since March 2019. He is on regular follow and growing well.
So Gaurav, can you tell us a little bit more about the Revati's experience and how this is emerging as one good option for us?
Actually, if Revati is there, she would be the best person because.
I don't know, is Ramya there? Because I think I saw Ramya, if she's there, and she can also share a little bit about the study.
Revati was also there. I could see
So,
her.
Dr. Revati or Dr. Ramya there, Pranjal, if you can
Yes,
unmute
yes.
them because they won't be able to.
I've unmuted both of them.
Yeah, hi, either of you. So this is, your moment. Tell us a little bit more about this.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you, sir, for letting us talk about this thing. So the protocol, it's called the LENDEX LCH study, which is the INPOG national trial. And the protocol basically has 2 drugs. One is lenalidomide and the other is dexamethasone. And these are given as an outpatient basis for relapsed refractory LCH. And the total protocol cycles as of now is 6 cycles. However, after 3 cycles, we do need to reassess and see what the response is like. Lenalidomide is given at a dose of 2.5 milligram once a day in those who are less than 15 kgs and 5 milligram once a day in those who are more than 15 kgs. It's given every day for 21 days of a 28-day cycle. And the dexamethasone is given weekly once for each of the 4 weeks of the cycle, which means that the child will actually get dexamethasone every week. And it's given at a dose of 0.8 milligram per kg in 2 divided doses. So this is the protocol. And from what we've seen, there hasn't been very severe side effects. None of the kids have required admissions per se. Cytopenias is what needs to be watched for, especially with lenalidomide. However, it's not been very significant from what we've seen. However, we of course need more patients and data on that. Yeah, and so far in the trial, we have about 5 or 6 children who are recruited. One includes Dr. Amita's patient, and there are other centers which hope to join. Yeah.
So thanks, Ramya, for that. So this child is actually currently doing very well.
May I say something, Amita?
Yeah, Revati, please.
Just to say that the LENDEX protocol has been very helpful during the lockdown. I know we started off saying that we would use it in the relapsed refractory setting, but we had children whom we diagnosed to have bad LCH in Jan-Feb, and those children towards March couldn't come back for vinblastine or come back for follow-up. And just for want of anything else to do, we've had 4 children who had quite significant multifocal bone disease and disseminated LCH who've been on upfront protocol LENDEX because they couldn't travel to the city for their treatment. And recently they've all had their PET-CT scan and are PET negative. So it is something to think about even upfront is what I'm saying. This is anyway not, it's off trial completely because this was all only during lockdown, but the maximum number of cycles we've given to any child is 9 cycles, and that was one with refractory Rosai-Dorfman, who had Rosai-Dorfman of the eye, and he's also responded really well.
The question which was asked by Anand was, after 6 cycles, what's the plan?
So that's I need everybody's suggestion, because this family, having had recurrences, is actually very
So,
of stopping treatment.
Dr. Amita, I would like to comment here. First, because there are so many people attending this session, one thing should be very clear, that Lendex is still a research protocol.
Absolutely.
We cannot conclude that it works, and we should not say that, okay, any refractory case use this. So those who want to go on the study, they can use this and recruit their patients on INPOC trial and wait for the final results to come.
So, Satya, that point is very well taken.
Yeah. Then the second point is that in your case, since your child has responded to cladribine very well, it's not a good idea to switch to Lendex. I think you should still give another 4 cycles of clofarabine, and that would control the disease very well.
Child has had 6 cycles of clofarabine.
Yeah. So that's
current
fine.
trials recommend that to be the maximum.
No. Let me finish. So as per the salvage protocols, but LCH protocols, what we have, usually there is a maintenance of 6-MP methotrexate for 2 years in those patients. So I would switch to that maintenance rather than Lendex, without evidence that Lendex would really help this child long term. And how long to continue, we don't have that data. So I would put on proper protocol, a proven protocol maintenance, which is there deriving from a salvage protocol from LCH group. So that's what I would do. Or I would take for allo transplant if the disease again starts coming up or something happens, then allo transplant is a backup option. So that's what I would do. Thank you.
Thanks for your inputs. The child had actually been on 6-MP methotrexate maintenance when he relapsed, and that prompted us to choose for our alternative. But I am actually contemplating, after completing 6 months of lenalidomide dexa, because he's very well at the moment, that to give him a prolonged maintenance course like you have suggested. So I think there is room for all different possibilities, but this is, the whole idea here is, when we've chosen refractory LCH, is to share with our junior colleague that sometimes, there is no standard treatment out there, and we have to look at all the options and see. Next slide, Pranjal. Pranjal, can I have the next slide?
Yes,
so
ma'am.
Let's go on this theme further.
Coming to our next case, Master MK developed multiple itchy erythematous skin rashes at 2 years of age, and he was diagnosed at Langerhans cell histiocytosis. At that time, there was evidence of liver, spleen, and pituitary involvement. The biopsy-proven liver and skin LCH was there. He was treated with vinblastine and steroid at the primary treating hospital, and there he had shown a good response. Next slide, please.
Pranjal, next slide.
He presented to us in June 2018 at 3 years of age, while still on the maintenance, with skin rashes, jaundice, and marked hepatosplenomegaly. His investigations revealed cholestatic jaundice with total bilirubin of 6.2, direct bilirubin 4.9, SGOT-PT 9154, and ALP increased 639 and GGTP 299. His MRI abdomen showed diffuse cholangiopathy, and MRCP showed sclerosing cholangitis. Next slide, please. So the organs involved in this patient were skin, liver, spleen, pituitary, and lymph nodes. There was no bone marrow or the lung involvement. Next slide, please.
So again, to both of you, I mean, what would be the optimal salvage regimen here now? So this is, because this is primarily a teaching exercise, I mean, the whole idea was that we follow initial strategies as per the current recommended protocols. And then when we still struggle, we look for all sort of innovative therapies. So we have risk organ involvement on a child who's, failed frontline therapy. Satya, can you take this?
So those who have failed the frontline therapy, as I discussed previously, that salvage regimens are based on whether you have risk organ involvement or no. If there is no risk organ involvement and there is disease progression or relapse, then vincristine and cytarabine based treatment option, one of the protocols is there in LCH4, which is a good option. I've seen few patients who have done very well, and I would try vincristine and cytarabine, low-dose cytarabine-based treatment as a salvage in those patients.
So
Those who have,
yeah, please go on. Please go on.
and those who have risk organ involvement, I would prefer to go to cladribine and cytarabine-based combination of cladribine, cytarabine as per LCH4. One of the arms is there, and give that. And if the child responds, then continue the maintenance for about 2 years as per the protocol. If at any point there is no good response in the risk organ, then allo transplant is a backup option, and targeted therapy has to be fitted somewhere. If the BRAF is present, then it's a treatment option, as we have discussed. Lendex is obviously, if nothing else is working and allo transplant is also not an option, then there is a paper from Revati's group. So it becomes an option and possibly can be explored. Thank you.
Next slide. So, like Pranjal, can I have the next slide?
So he was commenced on second-line chemotherapy with cladribine cytarabine combination. After 2 cycles, PET-CT showed complete metabolic response. This PET-CT is showing mainly hepatosplenomegaly with no FDG-Avid lesions. Next slide, please. So he was commenced on lenalidomide dexamethasone maintenance therapy. The parents were counseled regarding the need for possible liver transplant in the future in the view of sclerosing cholangitis. 5 months later, in May 2019, he came back for follow-up. At this point, he had persistent cholestasis and new onset lymphadenopathy. The lymph node biopsy confirmed the recurrence. This was the PET images. At that time, he had cervical and abdominal lymph node uptake. There was CNS involvement present and with the vertebral uptake also. Next slide.
I think they've all shared, what we would. So we will just go ahead and tell what we did in this patient so that we have time for some questions. Next
slide, please. So BRAF mutation done, it was absent. He was started on clofarabine chemotherapy. Disease assessment done after 2 cycles of chemotherapy showed complete metabolic response. Next slide, please. This is a PET scan comparing the 2 images. There was a complete metabolic response. Next slide, please. So as no match sibling donor.
So as Dr. Satya highlighted that, this is a very difficult, there's multiple risk organs involved, and this is perhaps the highest risk category because there is no single risk organ that was actually left alone. So he's already highlighted, and we'll take that a little bit more. So that's why as soon as we achieved remission after clofarabine, the child was taken up for
he was taken up for haploidentical transplant from father with reduced intensity conditioning regimen after extensive counseling for guarded prognosis. He had a stormy clinical course with gram-negative sepsis, and unfortunately, he succumbed on day 9 of transplant.
So Satya, can you share a little bit more that when about the role of allo-BMT in refractory?
So again, this is the only treatment option which remains once you have exhausted most of the treatment options. So those patients who respond well to cladribine or clofarabine and then they are put on maintenance treatment for 2 years, then quite a number of them are cured. But those who have progression or relapse despite this, then in them allogeneic transplant is the only option which is there and has to be executed. But in allogeneic, the data as far as published data is considered, match sibling donor option is the best option. And if you don't have a match sibling donor, then umbilical cord transplant is mentioned as the second best option. Haploidentical transplant, because the number of transplants are so less for refractory LCH, that the data on haplo outcomes in refractory LCH is very little, or I don't remember any published case report of haplo in refractory LCH, so I can't comment the results of that. So it's difficult choice that what to offer because we don't have data that this particular transplant option is a good option in this. But anyway, the other thing is about the conditioning. The conditioning has to be reduced intensity, so that you have already opted for reduced intensity. So it's really unfortunate that you lost this child, but these children anyway have poor prognosis. So even if he hadn't had transplant, this child would have died of disease anyway. So the transplant was required. That much I agree, but outcome was unfortunately not good for this patient. Thank you.
Gaurav, can you tell a little bit that, about the concept of, going for reduced intensity conditioning versus myeloablating conditioning in this setting? Of course, the transplant, haploidentical transplant, was really a measure of our desperation in this setting. But what are the current recommendations that if we were to take refractory LCH for allo-BMT?
Yeah, so very complex. Actually, Satya is a more experienced transplanter there, so you should probably ask him about the
I'm
competition.
just trying to give one and one question.
Yeah,
So Satya, take that. No, that's absolutely fine. Satya,
no, it's not,
just want you to highlight about,
Going to that, I did want to talk about the management a bit, if you have the time. Otherwise, we could skip that.
Please go ahead. We can take the.
Yeah, so while it is absolutely true, I agree here with Satya that no matter what route you would have taken, you would have ended at the spot. But the only other thing being whether it would have been the cholestasis and sclerosing cholangitis, which could have progressed and that would have caused a very messy.
Interrupt you. That despite our best counseling to not go for further treatment, this family was so motivated that they consented. They wanted a bone marrow transplant, and then subsequently, if disease stays in remission, the father was going to be the donor for the liver transplant as well. So there was no, getting around this family to telling them to, so sometimes push to,
they have the means and the motivation. You should be no doubt about it. But we might have reached the same spot. We would have, I guess, reached the same spot. But the route we would have taken may have been slightly different. We would have considered etoposide earlier in his treatment. It's a drug which you can give safely during with liver, in the presence of liver dysfunction, and probably you could have reached the same stage of some kind of disease remission with less stormy course and less toll which the repeated sepsis and other episodes would have taken on the body. Because that does compromise the patient when they come up for transplant. If they're going to undergo a lot of toxicity before they'll end up for transplant. So that is just about one thing which I would like to say over here. Regarding conditioning regimens, I can talk about it, but it's best that you ask Satya, because
just to highlight the current concept for allo-BMT very briefly, so that we can take some audience questions. Satya, do we?
Yeah. So reduced intensity conditioning is what we go with. So fludarabine and melphalan based conditioning is what is recommended. Although I don't have a lot of experience myself, I haven't done any allo transplant for LCH in my entire career of 20 years because nobody needed it. We had just one or two cases where they were like borderline but most responded well to cladribine or clofarabine based therapy. We had one girl where we did liver transplant first, and later on we were planning from the same donor a haplo transplant, but she succumbed after liver transplant. She had sclerosing cholangitis infant, just like this case. So we couldn't really do an allo transplant for that kid. So what literature mentions is that the disease remission is very important before taking for allo transplant. If disease is under control, they tend to have better outcomes. If disease is active before transplant, they tend to have poor outcomes. And the disease control takes about 3 months after transplant to kick in, that you have a deep remission and your allogenic cells have helped control the LCH. So for the first 3 months, there is always a risk that disease can become active again and kill the child. And many children tend to develop HLH. And because haplo transplant with PTCY approach has cytokine release in the first 3-4 days after transplant, very high fevers. So that per se increases the risk of HLH or cytokine storm haplotransplant, and this has underlying LCH. So maybe the combination my hypothesis that would have higher risk in such a child. So in conditioning, I may add Campath, which is there to calm down the system. And instead of ATG, I would use Campath, and that would reduce the risk of HLH and the cytokine storm. So an innovative conditioning is required, and I don't know what is best for this child and how to go about doing an haplo-PTCY in this. I would have preferred a non-haplo transplant in this because we don't have experience of haplo-PTCY in this particular setting, how to go about it. Thank you.
You're absolutely right. This was a measure of our desperation because there was no other possible donor source available. And you've highlighted that that is the current regime within the LCH4 protocol. And in fact, I'd recommend all the attendees to actually read, because the protocol actually gives a very good outline of how to go about managing most of the challenging situations that we see. Gaurav, Satya, Sunil, would any, can I have the next slide? And this just shows that, those who actually fail frontline therapy actually do very poorly. So this is true refractory, where you actually never got them into complete remission. The two cases that we've discussed, by definition, because they developed recurrence while still on continuation therapy, as per LCH4 criteria, they will classify that. But for in other protocols, you may consider them as recurrent. But both recurrent and refractory LCH can be sometimes challenging, though quite a few patients can be salvaged. But it is the true refractory patient who actually have poor response to the first 6 to 12 weeks of therapy that actually do extremely poorly. Next slide. I think this is, Satya highlighted it very nicely, and I think Ruchira put this point up in the chat box, that BRAF mutation, we are learning more about it. We know definitely that a very significant proportion of patients with LCH are positive. So in this study of 173 patients with the mutation and 142 without the mutation, it showed that mutation occurred in 88% of patients with high-risk disease, 69% of patients with low-risk disease, and 44% of patients with single-system low-risk LCH. So its presence does seem to correlate with aggression. Specifically, it was detected in 75% of patients with neurodegenerative syndrome and 73% of patients with pituitary involvement. And resistance to initial treatment and relapse were higher in patients with mutation. So as has been highlighted by both the experts, this is an area that if we have refractory or recurrent disease, we may actually want to look for this, because there is, yes, the drug is expensive, but there is an option out there where, trial could be considered for that. So any other options, Gaurav or Satya or Sunil, you'd like to share about, individual cases where we may work,
So, the thing about kinase inhibition with BRAF mutation is that it's the drug is ultimately a kinase inhibitor, and like all kinase inhibitors, it can inhibit the activity, it can inhibit the manifestation, but it can't wipe away the clone. So this is a severe limitation with which you have to sort of accept when you use inhibitor. And our thinking is that we have in our setting, especially in a LMIC setting, where patients are not able to afford this indefinitely, that the best way is that when we have used it, as a bridge, get them into some kind of stable state where organ control, limit the organ damage in a smooth sort of fashion, and then bring them back onto regular chemotherapy and salvage chemotherapy, as the case may be. So I think in our setting, we should be looking at that, because it's possible to continue patients on these drugs indefinitely.
It's prohibitively expensive. Dr. Veena in the audience raised her hand. Sunil, you wanted to say something?
No, Dr. Veena wants to ask a question.
Dr. Veena, Dr. Pranjal, could you unmute Dr. Veena? Oh, so by mistake. Next slide, Pranjal. So these are the options that we have discussed already. Next slide. So there is some, data about rituximab. So that is, again, to look at IVIG specifically in the setting of neurodegenerative LCA may have a role. And, bisphosphonates for single, refractory skeletal disease, there has been some anecdotal experience. So these are all, different things and some emerging modalities out there that you may consider in individual cases. Though we would not give bisphosphonate to a young child, before epiphyseal closure, because there can be premature epiphyseal closure and short stature because of that. So, but these are, if you're stuck, these are things. There's a lot of new information emerging about neurodegenerative LCH. So I think our children who have, these complications as adults, so there's lots more about LCH that we still need to understand. And I think that's all we had. If there's any specific, there was one question about MEK inhibitors. Is there any?
Should I stop screen sharing?
Yeah, you can stop screen sharing. Gaurav or Satya, I have no information about this, but there was a question from one of the attendees that is there any role of MEK inhibitors in this setting? You partially already answered it, but
as at present there is no data, so I have no comments.
Yeah, so I think this was our effort to take you through very simple skull lesion from no treatment to transplant. Everything is in play when we are dealing with LCH, especially when you are dealing with complicated LCH. And that's all. I'd like to thank Gaurav and Satya so much for their insightful inputs from their own clinical experience. Sunil, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you. I think it was a very interesting session. I think you beautifully highlighted the complexity of LCH. On one hand, it's such a simple disease to treat, and sometimes you don't do anything. But at the same time, it can be really complex and involve multi-system, multi-team approach, and can be very morbid disease as well. So with that, I thank you all again, Dr. Mitha, Dr. Gaurav, and Dr. Satya for your time and putting these nice cases together, and of course to Chandrika, who has probably done all the hard work in collecting the images and the cases together. So thank you very much, and again request for all of you, please give us some feedback on the timings, especially if you want to.
Thank you.
We'll see you next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sunil. Thanks, everyone.
Good evening. Yeah.
Thank you, Sunil. Thank you, Amita. Thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. The next session will be on next Thursday. We'll send you a mail about it. Thank you for joining. I'm ending the meeting.